The Guyanese morning was vibrant, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the wooden veranda. I leaned against the railing, feeling the humidity cling to my skin, and watched the world wake up. Nadia was already poised, a sharp contrast in her high-end professional wear, her designer handbag tucked under her arm like a shield. She watched me with that familiar narrowed gaze, cautioning me about the paint, as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted with the architecture of our own home. I brushed it off. Her uptight nature was just another facet of the wall she built between us, but she wouldn't let it go. To her, every movement I made was a testament to my carelessness, a sharp reminder of the reputation she felt burdened to uphold. Then there was Leo. At 4 years old, he was the center of Nadia's curated universe, an energetic bundle of curls and curiosity. When he scrambled toward her, toy truck in hand, the dynamic in the room shifted. I watched him and felt a strange, inexplicable ache, a softness in his eyes that didn't quite seem to belong to the rigid expectations Nadia placed on him. She insisted he was a Clark boy through and through, a reflection of her own side of the family. But even as I agreed, the words felt hollow in my throat. I offered to help, to be involved, but Nadia shut me down with the same cool efficiency she used in her career. I was meant to stick to my own things, to stay in the lane she had carved out for me. By afternoon, the living room had become a quiet theater for the family drama. Mrs. Clark, our mother, sat with her tea, acting as the wary mediator for a war she refused to acknowledge was happening. Nadia played the part of the productive, exhausted daughter, while I played the role of the quiet disappointment. When Leo toddled over to me, seeking a playmate, Nadia's rebuke was swift and sharp, a reminder that I was meant to observe, not participate in his upbringing. It wasn't just about discipline, it was about control. She viewed him as an extension of her own image, a project to be managed, and any affection I showed him felt like an encroachment on her territory. The tension followed us into the kitchen as the evening shadows stretched long across the tiles. Preparing dinner felt less like a meal and more like a tactical exercise.
My mother's critiques of my fruit slicing were met with Nadia's smug, pointed observations about my supposed weakness. I stepped aside, letting her take over, tired of fighting for a perfection that I knew was just a mask. I set the table in silence, my mind racing, trying to shake the feeling that I was constantly failing a test I hadn't even signed up for. The twilight air outside the garden gate provided only a brief moment of clarity. Mrs. Ram, our neighbour, leaned against the wood, her eyes tracking Leo as he played nearby. She spoke in riddles about deep roots and toddlers showing their true selves, her words chilling me more than I wanted to admit. She questioned Nadia's proximity to her own son, planting a seed of doubt that felt far too heavy for a simple neighbourhood observation. I tried to dismiss her as a busybody, but as I stood in my room later that night, clutching the woven friendship bracelet on my wrist, her voice echoed in my head. The house was silent, save for the hum of the night. I sat on my bed, turning the bracelet over in my hands, trying to make sense of the strange, familiar ache Leo's presence triggered in me. Everything in my life was dictated by family rules. Nadia was the best, I was the bad sister, and secrets were meant to stay buried. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself into the role I'd been assigned, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The roots here were deep, and for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath us was beginning to shift. The dining room was heavy with the scent of spices and the weight of unspoken tension. As we sat around the table, the candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the performative perfection of our family dinner. Nadia presided over the meal like a queen, her curry vibrant and searingly spicy. A dish she insisted was perfect, though it was clearly too much for a 4-year-old. When I gently suggested it might be a bit much for Leo, Nadia's response was immediate and sharp. She reminded me, as she always did, that he was a Clark boy, as if his heritage was a shield against the simple reality that he was just a child. But the friction wasn't really about the food. It was about the orbit he was supposed to keep. When Leo tried to move his seat to be closer to me, Nadia's rejection was cold and absolute. She didn't just want him to sit still. She wanted to exert control, treating his natural affection as a habit that needed to be broken. The living room later that evening felt like a gallery where every move I made was under scrutiny. I played with Leo on the floor, the simplicity of his toy trucks offering a rare, fleeting moment of genuine connection. But I could feel Nadia watching from the periphery. She saw every laugh and every hug not as a moment of bonding, but as a distraction. When he finally reached for me, seeking the comfort he wasn't finding in his mother's rigid affection, Nadia's reaction was a flash of naked, visceral jealousy. She pulled him away with a sharp command, her eyes locking onto mine with a warning I couldn't fully decipher. The hallway later that night provided the first real glimpse into the rot beneath our floorboards. I was passing the study when I heard their voices, my mother and Nadia, locked in a whispered, frantic exchange about complications and handling things. When I inadvertently revealed my presence, the transition from conspirators to dismissive hosts was instantaneous. They tried to wave it off as talk of laundry, but the lie was so thin it was transparent. As I walked away, the air in the house felt suddenly thinner, charged with the electric hum of a secret that was beginning to exert pressure on the walls. Out on the veranda, under the vast, uncaring canopy of the night sky, I tried to make sense of the dizzying, discordant pieces of the day. Leo's voice drifting from inside the house,
calling out for me in his sleep, felt like a phantom limb, a connection I didn't understand but couldn't sever. My mind spiraled into forbidden territory. The rejection I had lived with for years, the distance between Nadia and her own son, and the strange, haunting familiarity I felt when I looked at him. It all collided in a frantic, terrifying thought. I pushed it back down, telling myself I was just exhausted, that the rules of our family were absolute, but the seed of doubt had already sprouted. The final confrontation in the kitchen was the climax of a long, bruising day. Nadia found me there, the late-night silence shattered by her cold, composed malice. She didn't bother with the facade anymore. She dropped the pretense and went straight for the jugular, warning me to stay away from her son. Her eyes held a flicker of genuine fear, a panic that betrayed the perfect sister she pretended to be. I held my ground, demanding the truth, but she retreated into the same tired labels, the disappointment, the sister who didn't matter. But as I watched her walk away, I knew one thing for certain. She was terrified. And for the first time, I wasn't just a bystander in my own life. I was a witness to her desperation, and I knew the rules were about to break.
The breakfast table had always been a place of order, but that morning, the silence felt brittle, waiting to be shattered. Leo sat in his high chair, his eyes fixed on me with a clarity that made my skin prickle. When he looked at Nadia and then pointed to me, calling me mommy, the air in the kitchen seemed to vanish. I laughed it off, a simple mistake, a child's confusion. But the way Nadia's hand tightened around her spoon, turning her knuckles white, told a different story. She wasn't just annoyed, she was panicked. She snatched the fruit from my hand when Leo asked for more, her claim of "I am his mother," ringing out like a desperate, shrill command rather than a statement of fact. In the garden, the sun was bright, but the shadow of doubt was growing longer. Leo had wandered over to me with his broken toy boat, his trust in my ability to fix things absolute and instinctive. As I worked, he looked up and dropped the truth into the humid air like a stone in a still pond. He remembered a big house, a place where the three of us lived, where Nadia would disappear and I would stay. He spoke of it with the casual certainty of a child who had never learned how to lie. When he reached up and touched my cheek, telling me not to cry, I felt a physical pain in my chest, a ghost of a memory that was trying to force its way into the light, despite my frantic attempts to push it back down. The study, usually a sanctuary of files and order, became a battlefield. I confronted my mother, desperate for a reality that felt less like a hallucination. Her response wasn't comfort, it was an assault. She attacked my character, calling my life chaotic and broken, desperate to gaslight me back into the role of the disappointment. Why was she so defensive? Why was the truth so dangerous to her? The more I pushed, the more she retreated behind walls of indignation, leaving me with nothing but the chilling realization that she wasn't protecting me. She was protecting a secret. By evening, the kitchen felt like the inside of a furnace. Nadia didn't even bother to hide her animosity. She cornered me, her voice a razor-sharp whisper as she accused me of polluting Leo's mind. She spoke of order as if it were a substitute for maternal warmth, her coldness confirming exactly what I was beginning to suspect. Leo didn't just want me, he knew me. As she slapped the counter and screamed that he was her son, I realized she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me.
The night ended in the quiet isolation of my bedroom, where I stumbled upon the evidence that turned my world upside down. My own medical records, buried in my desk, detailed a trauma I had no memory of. 2 years of my life gone. 2 years ago, Leo had been 2. As I stared at the clinical notes on severe memory loss, the pieces began to click into a horrific, coherent shape. If I had been the one pregnant, if I had been the one there, then what had happened to my life? Had I been erased, or had I been stolen? As I hid the records away, my hands shaking with a terror that transcended anything I had ever felt, I knew one thing. I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for the woman I used to be, before they decided I was nothing.
The marketplace was usually a place of commerce, but that morning it felt like a trial. Every stall I passed and every face I met seemed to be tuned into the same frequency, the scandal of Leo's confusion. Mrs. Ram and her circle of gossips didn't even bother with the pretense of politeness anymore. They watched me with a predatory intensity, their questions about Leo calling me mommy, layered with implications that made my blood run cold. They spoke of blood as if it were a physical weight, something that couldn't be denied no matter how many times Nadia insisted on the official narrative. I walked away, but the gossip clung to me, a sticky, suffocating shroud that I knew was just the beginning. Back at the house, the porch had become a staging ground for a performance that was failing. When I stepped onto the boards, the hushed, frantic tone of my mother and Nadia's conversation snapped into an unnatural silence. They tried to redirect, to weave a story about the garden, but their eyes, darting and suspicious, betrayed them. They were terrified that the outside world was bleeding into the controlled environment they had fought so hard to maintain. When I confronted them about the neighbours, they didn't offer comfort or explanation. They attacked me, labeling me as the source of the chaos, as if my very existence and curiosity were the only things preventing our respectable family from being whole. By evening, the walls of the house began to feel like they were closing in. Near the shed, I caught a glimpse of a man whose presence in our lives felt like a jagged piece of a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve. He and Nadia were in a heated, low-voiced argument about handling me and keeping the records hidden. When I realized they were talking about the medical records I had discovered, the adrenaline hit me like a physical shock. My retreat turned into a frantic escape. I stumbled, the noise betraying me, and suddenly the house wasn't a home anymore. It was a labyrinth, and they were hunting me. The confrontation at the back fence was raw, stripped of the polite veneer we had worn for years. Nadia chased me into the dark, the moonlight illuminating her desperation. She didn't want a conversation. She wanted me neutralized.
When I threw the accusation of a stolen life at her, her reaction was a mirror of her own shattered composure.
The admission was written across her face in wide-eyed, panicked relief. The secret was out, and the game had fundamentally changed. She threatened me, but her voice lacked the authority it once had. She wasn't the powerful sister anymore. She was a thief, standing in the dark, watching her prize slip away. I marched back into the living room, past the threshold of my fear, and confronted them both. The revelation wasn't a slow burn. It was a detonation. I knew about the records, I knew about the theft, and I knew that Leo was my son, the boy they had stolen, the life they had hijacked under the guise of protection. My mother's tears were pathetic, a desperate attempt to recast her complicity as maternal concern, but I wasn't buying it. Nadia didn't even try to hide the venom. She looked at me, cold and clinical, and declared that I would never have him back. As I looked at them, the sister who had stolen my joy and the mother who had enabled the theft, I knew the war for my son's life had only just begun. They thought I was a broken girl, but as I stood my ground, I knew they were the ones who were about to break.
The archives of the old hospital were a tomb of forgotten lives, thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant time. I navigated the labyrinthine shelves, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, until my fingers finally closed around the yellowed file that would redefine my existence. As I read the birth record, the ground beneath me seemed to liquefy. Mother, Tessa Clark. The words weren't just ink on paper, they were a death warrant for the lie I had been forced to live. My own mother and sister had signed away my rights, effectively kidnapping my son while I was still reeling from trauma. The realization hit me not with a scream, but with a cold, sharpening fury. They had purchased silence, but they hadn't purchased my soul. I clutched the file to my chest, every heartbeat a drum roll for the war I was about to wage. I sought out Mr. Arthur, a family friend whose conscience had always felt like a flicker in the dark, and found him rocking on his porch, a relic of a time before the deception. When I pressed him for the truth, his hesitation was the only confirmation I needed. He admitted that the neighborhood had known, that whispers had circulated like smoke, but that my mother's power and her checkbook had kept the truth buried. He warned me that she was dangerous, that she had lost everything to maintain this facade. But his caution only galvanized me. They thought they had buried me alive, but they had only planted me. The confrontation in the town square was the first shot across the bow. I didn't care about the neighbors or the scene we were making. When I faced Nadia, I saw the true measure of her desperation. She didn't deny it, she justified it, claiming she had given him a better life. As if a life built on a foundation of stolen identity and psychological warfare could ever be good. She looked at me with cold, clinical malice, threatening to destroy me. But she failed to realize that you cannot destroy someone who has already lost everything. I was no longer the disappointment she could hide away. I was the ghost she had failed to exorcise. Back at the house, the atmosphere was suffocating. I slammed the file onto the kitchen table, a final, definitive end to the years of gaslighting. My mother's tears were a hollow performance, a desperate, crumbling attempt to recast herself as a martyr for the family name. She spoke of protection, but I knew the truth. She had sacrificed her own daughter to preserve an image of perfection that was rotting from the inside out. When Nadia entered, the veneer of composure finally fractured. There was no more pretense of sisterhood, only the raw, ugly reality of a thief being confronted by the woman she had robbed. As I bolted for the driveway, the night air cool and sharp against my face, the battle lines were finally drawn. They tried to block my car, to silence me with their desperation. But they were too late. I left them standing in the dark, their power and their prestige dissolving in the wake of my engine's roar. I was driving toward the only truth that mattered now. The life I had been owed for 4 years. They had tried to break me, but they had only succeeded in creating something they could no longer control. The truth was finally in motion, and there wasn't a lie on earth that could stop it now.
The police station was a sterile, unforgiving environment, a sharp contrast to the carefully managed world I had been forced to inhabit. I sat on the hard bench, my hands trembling as I clutched the medical file, the tangible proof of a life stolen. When I finally handed the documents to the officer, the relief that washed over me was quickly tempered by the cold reality of bureaucratic protocol. He was methodical, questioning, and professional, but he didn't share my urgency. To him, this was a case file. To me, it was the breath in my lungs. As I waited for his calls, the 2 years of being the disappointment felt like a heavy coat I was finally shedding. He promised an inquiry, but I knew the game wasn't over. They had money, they had influence, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Later that afternoon, the quiet corner of a local cafe became the site of a devastating revelation. Mr. Arthur, a man who had watched us grow up, sat across from me, his nervousness vibrating through the table. I expected him to be a bridge to the truth, but the bridge led to a deeper, darker chasm. He didn't just confirm my suspicions, he annihilated them. Nadia wasn't just a thief, she wasn't even a biological participant in the ruse. There had been no pregnancy, no natural progression of life. It had been a performance from start to finish, a theater of deceit orchestrated by Gloria to maintain the illusion of a perfect family lineage. The realization that my mother had bought a baby and staged a production that effectively erased my own motherhood left me reeling, the coffee in front of me turning cold as my world turned to ice. Returning to the house felt like entering a den of vipers. Nadia and Gloria sat in the living room, a glass of wine between them, the picture of refined stability. When I threw the truth at them, the police inquiry, the knowledge that Nadia wasn't even the biological mother, the mask finally slipped. The defiance they showed was frantic, a pathetic clawing at a narrative that no longer had a leg to stand on. Gloria attacked Arthur's character, calling him senile, but
The terror in her eyes was unmistakable. I wasn't just a sister seeking answers anymore, I was a witness for the prosecution, and they knew it. Nightfall brought a new, chilling layer to the nightmare. Hidden in the dark near the garden hedge, I watched Nadia on the phone, her voice stripping away the last of the perfect sister persona. She was talking to a co-conspirator about bank papers and the impending collapse of their financial house of cards. When she realized I was listening, the hunt was on again. But this time, the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't running in fear. I was running with the knowledge that they were as hollow and terrified as the lives they had built. She threatened me, but her voice was laced with the panic of a woman who had nowhere left to hide. The driveway was the final stage of the exodus. Nadia, stripped of her composure and her lies, was loading a suitcase into her car. Her betrayal of Leo, the boy she had claimed as her own perfect son, now complete and casual. She admitted with a chilling lack of remorse that she had been paid to perform the role of mother. As she drove off into the night, abandoning the child she had stolen and the family she had used, the weight of the night crashed down on me. She was gone. The facade was officially dust, and the only person left to answer for the magnitude of this betrayal was the woman standing in the darkened house, waiting for me to walk through the door.
The kitchen, once the stage for our family's curated perfection, felt hollow and cold as the morning sun crawled across the tiles. Gloria sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had long since lost its warmth, her presence diminished and spectral. Nadia was gone, leaving behind nothing but the silence of her betrayal, and the boy she had claimed as her own perfect legacy. When I confronted Gloria about Leo being abandoned, she deflected with the same tired, clinical detachment she had used to justify the theft of my life. She spoke of order and future, as if they were commodities she could trade for a daughter's soul. But the words were empty. The rift between us was no longer a disagreement. It was a chasm created by a crime that could never be rectified by a mere apology. In the back garden, the afternoon light felt more honest than it had in years. I sat on the bench, watching Leo play in the dirt, the sight of him unburdened by the expectations of the perfect family. When he looked up and asked where Nadia had gone, my heart broke for his confusion. But when he called me Mummy, the pain transformed into something profound and steady. He didn't see the scandal or the legal battles ahead. He saw his mother. I made a promise to him and to myself that the cycle of secrets ended there. He was my stolen miracle, the boy who had defied the lies simply by existing. And for the first time, I felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of being the woman he knew me to be. The evening brought a final ugly spasm of the past. Mr. Arthur, a man who had finally run out of ways to hide from his own complicity, arrived at the house looking like a man who had seen his own ghost. He tried to distance himself from Gloria's wreckage, but his arrival only served to trigger her final pathetic lashing out. She screamed at him, threatening him with the same vitriol she had once reserved for her social rivals, but her power had evaporated. When Arthur finally walked out, leaving Gloria to sob in the living room, it wasn't just a friend leaving. It was the last support beam of her pride collapsing. She was left alone,
surrounded by the echoes of a life built on nothing. Miles away, in a sterile hotel room, Nadia was busy shedding her skin. She wasn't fleeing because of guilt. She was fleeing because the game had stopped paying dividends. On the phone with a co-conspirator, she cut ties with a cold, jagged efficiency that proved she had never been a mother, only a performer who had grown tired of the role. As she checked out, leaving the life she had hijacked and the boy she had used behind, she didn't look back. She was heading into a new world, a free agent of her own self-interest, leaving us to navigate the wreckage she had left in her wake. Late that night, on the porch where we had first started to unravel, I held a sleeping Leo close. The stars were brilliant, indifferent to the chaos we had survived. I had no plan, no money, and the path ahead was obscured by the debris of our past. But for the first time, I felt the ground beneath me was solid. Gloria was alone in the house. Nadia was a memory on the wind, and Leo was home. I looked at the dark silhouette of the old house, the site of my erased years, and felt a strange, quiet peace. We were here. We were real. And for the first time in 4 years, the truth was the only thing that mattered.
The morning light in the kitchen felt heavy, pregnant with the end of everything we had known. Gloria sat among her letters, a monarch presiding over a kingdom of ash, her defiance finally flickering out. When I demanded the letters she had hidden, the ones from Leo's father, she didn't fight. She simply surrendered them, a final admission that the narrative she had constructed was no longer sustainable. As I read the correspondence, the man I had been told was a man with no future emerged not as a failure, but as a ghost of the life I had actually lived. I didn't say goodbye to the home. I said goodbye to the hostage taker who had masqueraded as my mother. The bus station was a liminal space, a perfect place for ghosts to materialize. When Marcus approached, I didn't recognize him at first. The man from my university days, erased by Gloria's interference.
He told me the truth I had been too terrified to hope for. He hadn't left me. He had been paid to disappear, manipulated into believing I was dead or dying, just another casualty of my mother's ambition. When he saw Leo, the recognition was instantaneous, a mirror image of his own brother, a testament to a connection that had survived despite the silence. We were a family severed by a checkbook, and as he held our son,
The 2 years of stolen time felt like a bridge we were finally starting to cross. We spent the evening on a park bench, the chaotic pulse of the city fading into a backdrop for our quiet miracle. Marcus was a man who had lived in the shadow of a lie, and as he produced the transfer records, the ironclad evidence of Gloria's bribery, the weight of the last 4 years finally lifted. We weren't just a collection of victims anymore. We were a coalition of the truth. We had the evidence to tear down the facade of the Clark name. And as Leo played with his truck nearby, vrooming through a future that was finally his own, we knew the long road of running was over. The police station entrance glowed like a beacon in the night. Walking in with Marcus and Leo, I didn't feel the paralyzing fear that had defined my life since the records were unearthed. I felt a cold, clear resolve. We handed over the files, the records and the bribe receipts, the keys to Gloria's professional and personal ruin. As the officers took our statements, the house of cards didn't just tumble, it disintegrated. For the first time, I wasn't the sister who was confused or the woman who was sick. I was a mother, a partner, and a witness to the truth. The final scene played out on our driveway under the glare of police lights. Gloria watched from the porch, a silhouette of total defeat as the officers approached to take her away. There was no grand plea for mercy, only the hollow admission of a woman who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. As she was led away, she looked at me not with anger, but with the hollow resignation of someone who realized her good run was just a long, expensive prison sentence of her own making. I held Leo's hand, felt Marcus's presence beside me, and watched the taillights of the squad car vanish into the dark. I wasn't just free of her, I was finally, for the first time, home.
The interrogation room was a sterile box of fluorescent light and cold metal, the perfect stage for the final dismantling of my mother's reality. Gloria sat under the single hanging bulb, stripped of her house, her social standing, and her final alibi. When I pushed her for the truth about the missing 2 years of my life, the dam finally broke. She didn't offer a grand conspiracy. She offered a tragedy. A car crash 2 years ago had shattered my world and taken my memory, but it hadn't taken the baby. My son had survived, and Gloria, in a warped act of protection that was really just a reclamation of control, had stolen him. She had recast his birth, hidden my recovery, and systematically gaslit me into believing I was the disappointment, the broken daughter, while she curated the perfect life for the grandson she had effectively kidnapped. Emerging from that room, I felt as though I had been hollowed out. Marcus was waiting in the hallway, his face a map of confusion and rage as I recounted the accident that had been erased from my own history. The cruelty of it, that she had used my vulnerability to rewrite the narrative of my own motherhood, was a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. But then I saw Leo. He was waiting for us, and when he saw me, the transition from the sterile, terrifying present to the warmth of the future was instantaneous. He didn't see the police reports or the scars. He saw his mother. And in that moment, when he reached for Marcus and asked if we were finally a family, the devastation of the past began to lose its grip.
We stood before the old house one last time, the structure looking small and diminished in the evening light. It had been the theatre for my erasure, the site of the prison I had been forced to inhabit while my own son grew up just down the hall. But as Marcus took my hand and Leo cheered from the car, it was just wood and stone, stripped of its power to haunt us. The secrets that had acted as the foundation of our family were now just debris, scattered by the truth we had finally dragged into the light. The house of cards hadn't just fallen, it had been completely incinerated. As we drove away, the open road stretched out before us, illuminated by the vast, uncaring beauty of the moon. I looked at Marcus and our son, realizing that for the first time in years, the story we were living was actually ours. I wasn't the disappointment, the broken sister, or the woman without a past. I was a survivor, a mother, and a partner in a truth that no amount of money or prestige could ever replicate. The stars above felt like a promise, a clean slate, a new dawn, and a life that was finally, unequivocally real. We didn't know exactly where we were going, but for the first time, it didn't matter. The destination wasn't a place.
It was the simple, beautiful freedom of existing without a lie. Leo drifted off to sleep, whispering about trucks and family, and I watched him in the rearview mirror, his breathing steady and peaceful. The long, jagged road of the past was behind us. Ahead lay the truth, a wide open horizon, and the only thing that had ever mattered, the three of us, together, finally home. The morning at the courthouse was crisp, the air cleansed of the suffocating weight that had defined the last few years. Standing on the steps with Marcus, his hand firm and grounding in mine, I felt a confidence that had nothing to do with prestige or status. As Gloria was led past us, the final pathetic remnants of her authority crumbling with every shackled step, I didn't feel the sting of the past. She tried one last time to haunt me with her cold dismissiveness, but I was unreachable. I was no longer the daughter she had erased. I was a mother, a witness, and a woman who had survived the fire she started. As she was led away, I didn't look back. The goodbye was final, not because of the law, but because I had finally stopped listening to her voice. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the gravity of justice. Sitting on the stand, I watched the judge review the evidence, the hospital records, the transfer documents, the undeniable ledger of a stolen life. When Gloria tried to scream her innocence, her desperation was met not with sympathy, but with the cold, hard gavel of reality. The verdict was a release, a sentence that didn't just punish her for her crimes, but validated every shred of intuition I had held on to in the dark. As the judge declared her guilty, the last anchor of my trauma snapped. I looked over at Marcus, his face radiant with pride, and saw my son in the gallery, cheering in his innocent, exuberant way. The weight was gone. We had won. Stepping out onto the courthouse steps, the world felt impossibly vibrant. The reporters were there, the noise of the town reaching out to claim the story. But it didn't matter. We weren't a scandal anymore. We were a family.
The stone steps under our feet felt like the foundation of a brand new world. As I lifted Leo into my arms, I realized that I wasn't the disappointment I had been labeled. I was the architect of my own liberation. Marcus was right. This wasn't just the end of a nightmare. It was the prologue to the life we were always meant to live. One where the truth wasn't a danger, but a heartbeat. By sunset, we found ourselves in a city park, the chaotic energy of the urban landscape fading into the peaceful glow of the evening. Leo raced ahead, his laughter a song of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the trees.
Marcus and I walked behind him, watching our son inhabit the freedom we had fought so hard to secure. There were no more secrets lurking in the shadows, no more hidden files, and no more performative expectations to satisfy. The stolen years were gone, but the years ahead were entirely ours. For the first time, I felt a deep, resonant peace, a quiet knowing that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As night fell, we stood on the balcony of our new home, the city lights below blinking like a million tiny, hopeful stars. Leo drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with races and the simple security of his parents' voices. I leaned into Marcus, feeling the solid, enduring reality of his presence, and looked out at the vast, open sky. The lies had tried to define me, but they had failed. The truth hadn't just saved us, it had forged us into something unbreakable. I whispered a final, silent goodbye to the ghosts of the past and turned toward the life we were building. We were home, at last, today and forever.